Remote viewing is a term for basically what people used to call psychic sensing, something like that, where you can be free of time and space and throw your mind or put your mind wherever you want to. The way it started was a psychic named Ingo Swann wrote to Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. They had him come over and do some testing. The first thing he did when he went to the Stanford Research Institute in California, Northern California, and I think it was 75 or 74, something like that, early to mid-70s. He got off the plane, he went to their lab, and he immediately told them about some device that was in another lab at Stanford Research Institute that was secret, that nobody really knew about. He told them exactly what it was and drew them a picture of it. So, of course, they said, okay, we need to go ahead with this program and study him a little bit more. Swann became basically the psychic part of the program, meaning he developed the program, he developed the protocols, he developed the training. So what they did was they said, people can do that, they have this ability. Everybody has this ability, actually. It's just that some people have this ability better than others. You can all sink a basket, but you can't all sink a basket like Michael Jordan. That's the thing that was example that was given to me. With enough practice, you can do a little bit better, but some people are just naturally better at it than others. Their job was to find people that were better at it than others and come up with a protocol or a set of protocols that would allow them to do this easier. What they came up with, there were different types of remote viewing. Coordinate remote viewing was they would have a stack of targets. Like somebody would walk out to, say, a park near Stanford Research Institute or somewhere in the Bay Area of San Francisco, California. They'd go to a park, they'd look at what was there, they'd take a picture, and they would write a set of coordinates. Either they be, the street address, or more likely the latitude and longitude of that place. They would take these stack of envelopes with 30 different places back. Randomly, somebody would pick them out. And how many of you people know this? Not too many? Yeah. I'm like, oh, okay, of course Micah does. And they brought people in that first Swann knew about, but then they had a bigger network, so they found more people. Pat Price was one of the first ones. He was a retired police sergeant in Burbank, California, who had solved a lot of cases basically with his psychic gifts, and they had heard about him. They would take this random envelope, give it to a person that was basically the tester and the person that was the subject. They would give them the coordinates, just the coordinates, and the closed envelope, possibly, and they would just sit there and write down their impressions of whatever that was. And as it developed, they discovered the less you thought about what you thought it was and more concentrated on the impressions, the better the remote viewing would go. So they would, the person would write down their impressions, big, small, outside, inside, colors, shapes, movement, emotion associated with whatever the target was, all these impressions. Then the important part of the test happened, where they would open the envelope, see how they did, and then the most important part, they would take them to the target and show them what they, whether they had gotten it or not, take them to the target and show them what it was. Because as it turned out, they later found out that time really didn't make any difference. They were experiencing the target as the person experienced it when they first looked and went and wrote down everything that was associated with that target. And they found out that that kind of connection actually helped close the loop, as it were, between an impression and then actually knowing what had happened. I mean, it was very important to tell the person how good they were at it, because if they did, they found that sometimes they'd get better at it, to the point where some of the hits got better and better and better, and they kept those people. Eventually, the military got interested, and they started a program, I think in the late 70s. I think the first one was Grill Flame, was the code word for it. Yeah, I think the first one was called Grill Flame. because they just use, basically, yeah, barbecue remote viewing, BRV. They used terms that had nothing to do with the program. I mean, that's normal in the military. Anyway, this started with 2 or 3 remote viewers, and this grew in fits and starts, and eventually it went all through the 1980s, and I think the early 90s it finally got shut down, as all the remote viewers told me, basically for political reasons, because they couldn't find somebody that was, they couldn't find enough support within the government to do what they were doing because of prejudice, obviously, against remote viewing. What if people know that we're using tax dollars for psychics and mind readers and all that? And they weren't really mind readers. They just were looking for targets. And according to the ones I talked to, they found lots of targets. They were not perfect, not 100%, not even 90 or 80%. They were probably in the 60, 70 percentile, that's what they claimed, of getting useful intelligence from the remote viewing program. And basically they became the last resort, or maybe sometimes the first resort, or just another source of information for people in the CIA, the NSA, and people that gave them these tasks. That's about it. That's sort of the history of remote viewing and how it was developed, and from my point of view, what it is.
I'll just add for context a little. When we talk about something like remote viewing, one of the first questions that might come to mind is, now, why in the world would governments engage in something like that? But you got to kind of take into context both the period during which, even though with direct relation to remote viewing, time may not have necessarily mattered. That's an interesting question in itself. How does our concept or perception, human perception of time, relate to this? What is consciousness, And then the existing tradition of altered states of consciousness, out-of-body experiences, things along these lines. Arguably, the remote viewing experience, although triggered or something that is, almost like a focused meditation that a person actively goes about doing, is similar to the existing tradition throughout cultures of out-of-body experiences. And just for a little continuity, later today in my talk I'm going to be discussing OBEs, near-death experiences also, so you'll kind of get a picture of how all this relates. But this is a good thing to be talking about early on because it shows you a practical use of the idea of entering an altered state of consciousness to do something extraordinary that goes outside the conventional sense of what human capabilities should entail. Why would governments do this? Why would money be put behind something like this? Quite simply, you have to look at the period during which this took place. There was a book published, you guys may have seen this book, and I've got an old dusty copy of it, Psychic Experiments Behind the Iron Curtain. And, again, during the Cold War, there were a lot of experimental technologies, even if we want to refer to this maybe as a spiritual technology, that would have been explored for purpose of just gauging whether or not there was legitimacy to it. If it's effective and it helps us glean information about the enemy, or for that matter, any other kind of intelligence, any kind of existential threat to humanity, this would be something that would be explored. Fast forward ahead of some of the kinds of programs that Greg described for us, and of course, during, I guess, maybe the 1990s, remote viewing was kind of popularized, probably by Major Ed Dane the most, going on Coast to Coast AM and talking about the shot across the bow. And he told a very compelling series of stories and a narrative about predictions that were made, and again, existential threats that he believed were awaiting humankind in the next few years. Now, to my recollection, I don't know that many of them necessarily came true, did they?
Some did, and I will discuss why if
Yeah,
you like.
we'll toss it back over to Greg too. So,
okay, the issue of Ed Dames, he was in the program. This is what I gleaned from other people in the program, reading books about it, doing the interviews, off the record kind of things. And this was, in the 90s when I interviewed these people, while this was still going on, or at least the popularization of it. What they said about Ed Dames was he was in the program. He did do some remote viewings, but they were unofficial because he was basically an office person helping out. But he took a more active role, which I think they allowed him to do. It's just that he wasn't one of the main viewers, as far as I recall. But afterwards, I was saying, well, how does he do his predictions if you don't think he's very good at it? And they said he subscribes to science journals. Like, what? Well, if you read a science journal, something's going to be in there that is weeks or months before it's going to get in the news, because sometimes it'll be something that develops into something newsworthy, and sometimes it doesn't. So, if there's a study on, suddenly, for example, frogs are showing up with extra limbs or something in certain areas of the country, they're studying this. He would make this prediction, then of course, 3 weeks, 6 months later, it comes out in the news because he read it in the, so you have to be on the lookout for things like that. Nevertheless, even with stories like that and a skeptical attitude where you say, what I call a fundamentalist skeptic attitude, meaning you don't believe it no matter what evidence is presented to you. Nevertheless, like I said, I think the method does work. One, because I talked to all these people who I don't think were lying to me. And two, or if they were, they sure had a nice coordinated lie where they all told me the same thing in basically slightly different ways. And two, I did it a few times. And the first time I did it was, it worked amazingly, like way out of the possibility of chance, worked. Would you like me to describe what I did?
Repeat it.
And I will stop hogging the microphone here, but there is a book by Joe McMoneagle, which I will actually reference in my talk, not because of its remote viewing content. He has a model of how we perceive things, which I think is very important. But in the book, he said, if you want to try this for yourself, here's an experiment. Take something in your house, find a friend who picks something in their house, put it in a box, and put it somewhere in your house, like in a closet or in the back room. I put it in the utility room with the water heater. And have your friend do the same thing, like I said. And pick a date in the future. Like, we are going to tell each other what we think this is, each other, at the same time, like at 3 o'clock next Tuesday. So at 3 o'clock, what you do is throughout the week, you just write down your impressions of what might be in that box. And I didn't sit there like concentrating. What I did was, throughout the day, suddenly things would pop into my head and I'd write them in a little notebook. And at the end, I had kind of a page of, shapes, colors, all that. Based on all the literature that I'd read, I was like, don't give in to the urge to make it into something. Like, if you think it's If you think it's a blender, don't think of a blender. Think of the parts of a blender: metal, hard, white, all these things. But don't try really hard not to turn it into, because then your conscious mind says, okay, that's what it is, and it steers you in that direction, and you've shut off that channel. So I just did, my impressions. My friend did the same thing. The next Tuesday at 3 or whatever it was, we called each other on the phone. Oh, and then afterwards you go over to the person's house and look at the target, sort of like coordinate remote viewing. So I said that what I saw was round, and it was like something round with something straight attached to it. It was multicolored. It had kind of a rough surface on the top and a smooth surface on the bottom. And what it was a Pez dispenser with Miss Piggy's head on the top. Yes, I would say that was a pretty good hit. I mean, I actually drew like a stick with a ball at the end, and then I drew ridges on it and some of the colors, and I got some of the colors right. My friend drew basically he said, metal, cold, hard metal with ridges in it, and he drew, he said, like a cogs in a wheel, like a mechanical wheel. And then he wrote a few other things about it, electricity, power, and then he said, power drill? That's exactly what it was. He got it 100%. He shouldn't have said power drill because he went right for the whatever it was, but I told him, why'd you do that? He goes, I just couldn't, I had to write that down for some reason. I thought that's what it was. And like I said, he was 100% right. And people tell me, oh, well, he could have guessed. I said, both of us, the first time, 100, not me, but him, 100% right? I don't think so. The funny thing is, we did it one more time, and we were completely wrong. We tried it again a few weeks later, completely wrong, nowhere near it. And this is something that's known in remote viewing and psychic things as a beginner's luck kind of thing. You don't have a preconception, you're not all excited about it, you're just kind of like, let's see what's going to happen. Be open to the experience, kind of like, ghost hunting or anything. If you're open to it, things will happen. If you're either too eager or too skeptical, it seems to shut off the signal, as it were. So that's my experience with it. And like I said, if you have an experience with something, it's a lot different than hearing about it. Which is why I'm kind of pushing for other things in ufology and ways to give people a very direct experience, because you cannot describe it to people. I can describe all I want to what happened, to you all I want what happened, but if you don't actually experience it yourself, you don't have a feeling emotionally deep inside that yes, this thing actually works, and it worked for me.
Sure. I haven't had an experience with remote viewing personally, directly, that I know of. I certainly know somebody, well, I know two people. I know Greg, obviously. But my ghost, I was going to say ghost cases again, my haunted co-host, Holly, funny thing. So for those of you that were at the Queens County Museum last night, weird stuff. But when we investigated it, there was a moment, which Dylan would remember, where Holly came down to us and said she felt a name come to her. Now, it's not that we're lazy inherently or bad researchers. We sort of learn about the history of a location. This was built here and here. Maybe this is the story of a particular haunting that people have told or whatever. But, we don't walk in with 50 pages of notes about everything that ever happened in that building, because for one thing, that tends to influence our own perceptions. So we kind of like to go in semi-cold, as it were. This part, totally cold. And so we say, well, Holly, what was the name that came to your mind? And the name that had come to her mind out of the blue, and she was just sort of standing in a room trying to commune, I guess, with whatever might be out there. I get demons, she gets other things. And she said, this name came into my mind, Lucy. Well, okay, unless you're a Charlie Brown fan, now owned by a Nova Scotia production company, I might add, the whole Peanuts franchise. Lucy's not a name that, today is a popular name. I'm sure there's still people who name their kids Lucy today, but if you were to look at the top 20 names of babies in North America that people are naming their kids, girls, Lucy, I'm pretty sure, is not in that top 20 list. But years and years ago, it would have been. So again, if you were at the Queens County Museum last night, so why does this name come into Holly's head? So I said, do you know a Lucy? Is there something about you that's, and she said, no, I don't know any Lucy. I've never met any Lucy in my life, kind of thing. Well, it turns out that Lucy, and we did not know this. There's honestly, unless we went and did some really deep research, and Holly's lazier than I am, I know she wouldn't do this. There's no real way we would know that. So she picks this name out of the ether as she's trying to focus, as Greg said, not on a particular thing, but just kind of opening and like, give me an impression, give me something. So this name comes to her. And Lucy was the name of the, now help me out, Linda, nod your head if I get this right. Lucy was the name of one of the children of Simeon Perkins. If you go down to the Queens County Museum, you'll see there's the museum, which is a very modern building. But next to it is a much older building, and that goes back all the way to the 18th century. It was the original home of Simeon Perkins. As an historian, I'm well familiar with Simeon Perkins because he left behind one of the primary documents in Canadian history. He kept a diary, a journal, which any young Canadian history student in college who's studying maritime Canada will run across at some point or another. In fact, he even wrote about a UFO incident in his diary. He didn't call it that, but anyway, so we all know who Simeon Perkins is. Less known is who his family was, who his kids were. Anyway, he had a child named Lucy. Lucy had a very traumatic experience. Once we made this connection, like Holly ran the name by Linda, and Linda immediately went, oh yeah, Simeon Perkins had a daughter named Lucy. Oh, well, that's something we should go on Wikipedia or somewhere. And cool, now that we know, we should do a little research. So we sat the internet's a wonderful thing. So we sat there, took a 20-minute break from our ghost investigation, and said, "Yep, there's Lucy Perkins," and And turns out that she had had this traumatic experience as a child with fire, that she had been burned, badly burned, by sitting as a kid next to a hearth, and the fire had gotten on her, and it's like, I've been badly burned. Didn't kill her. And so Holly was convinced that, and we were having a bunch of weird things happening, and so Holly went with this stream that this is Lucy trying to contact me, and that's why the name came into her head, that she had opened herself up to it, and pop, in comes Lucy. So, I get Mephistopheles in my head. She gets the name of Lucy. And I just thought, well, this is really weird. There's no reason why that name should come into her head, and yet it did. And last night, when we were at the Queens County Museum, we hauled out the ghost box for the folks that were there, and I was in a different room, and even I could hear it. I mean, Dylan's over there. He's like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen on any of our things. And, it sounded like they were trying, it was Lucy you were sort of trying to interact with, right, Linda? And it sounded like a girl, the voice screaming or crying, coming through the ghost box. And eventually, which is weird, because it's not, if you're picking up a radio station and stuff like that, generally you can write stuff like, you're picking out words, but you're usually not picking out the sound of children crying. Not even on Q104 in Halifax do you hear stuff like that. So there is this spirit or whatever that Linda firmly believes is there, that others have encountered, that Holly dreamt of, or not dreamt of, but just came into her mind. And while it's not technically remote viewing, I think it's in that same ballpark of, if you open yourself up to an experience, but you don't preconceive what it is you're looking for. You wait for it to come to you, then things start to come to you, and then it's like pieces of a puzzle. It's up to you maybe sometimes to figure out how to fill in the pieces of that puzzle. So in Holly's case, that's what she did. She's done that at other times. That's just the one that really sticks out in my mind, and because we're in Liverpool, probably. Real quick, I will say something about the program itself. So Project Stargate, which the American government admits to putting $20 million, which honestly isn't a lot of money for the U.S. Defense Department. They do a lot of stuff into some really far out things. Why not? We got tons of money to burn. But it's like Micah and Ryan and Greg will laugh because I'm always bashing people for using anonymous sources. But I've had the pleasure of meeting a couple former CIA agents over the years, and both of them, to me, while not directly involved in Project Stargate, said they were, and one of them, you guys would know him, he's dead, so I can talk about him now. Carl Flock went on to work in the senior levels of the American Defense Department, and he was heavily involved in UFOs and interested in the subject. So Carl was an interesting cat. Good guy. Weird guy, but good guy. So anyway, Carl once said, look, because I was joking with him, and Project Stargate came up, and I said, $20 million, Carl. That's nothing. The Defense Department throws that away on, towels and toilets. And he went, well, that's the $20 million that they admit to. I went, what? He said, well, that's the public consumption number. Any number the Defense Department gives you or the intelligence agencies give you that's out in the public, that's what they put out there and they're willing to admit to. You can usually stick another zero on that. Now, not necessarily directly through that program, but through other programs that might not ever be known. My Uncle Stan, who's the grandfather of Roswell, talks about black budget projects, which run into the billions, and some people would even say trillions over the years of the American Defense Department and the intelligence agencies, that even Congress doesn't know what's in them. They just authorize the expenditure without knowing what's in the project because they're highly secret. So Carl said, imagine an iceberg like this. And he said, what you see in the water, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's what they'll let you know about. What's underneath, that's what you don't see. And that's where all the money's going. And I can't tell you where it's going because I don't know. But if they said $20 million, don't write it off, Paul, as something that was just a throwaway, because it could have been $200 million. It could have been $2 billion. And frankly, they could still be doing it because, as Carl put it, we shut down programs all the time, officially. And then we continue them off the books where even people like the president aren't aware of them. So, I took Carl seriously, and that sort of opened my mind to the possibility of what you'll hear in American politics now. They talk about the deep state. They do it in the wrong way, in a very conspiratorial way. But there is a deep state in a different way, and a lot of it has to do with black budget projects that even your politicians in the U.S. aren't aware of. So the other CIA agent I know, who I can't name because I signed an affidavit that as long as he and his wife are alive, I can't name them, but they gave me all sorts of interesting information that I've put in my interesting if true file at the 2007 X conference, where I had a meeting with them outside the conference. And one of the things he said, he talked about remote viewing. I had a film called 2000 Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Cases, and I thought that's all he wanted to talk about. But he started, he's like, this UFO stuff, some of what you're talking about is real. It really does work. He wouldn't tell me whether it's space aliens or whatever, but he said there's all this other stuff that the government's into, and he brought up remote viewing. And I said, remote viewing, as Greg would know, I didn't take it seriously, like, remote viewing. And he said, yeah, no, it's real. So I had already talked to Carl, and I thought I'd use the iceberg metaphor, because I thought it's a good metaphor. I said, so it's kind of like this. Consciousness is like this, and here's what we can see, and then underneath is everything that we can't see, and people tap into it. I thought it was very clever. And he said, yeah, sure, it's like an iceberg. Only imagine smashing the iceberg into a million pieces and then shifting it throughout time and space, and then eventually some of the pieces will coalesce back to you in a shape that doesn't look anything like an iceberg. Sure, kid. Yeah, it's like an iceberg. And so I went, okay, I'm going to stop using that metaphor for remote viewing. But he was dead serious, and he said, look, this happens. He said, I know people who do it, and there are people in senior levels of the American Defense Department and intelligence establishment that are still using remote viewing for military and intelligence purposes. I don't know if that's true. I just know that this guy was as serious as stone, something like that. And, he wanted to talk to me about it. So those are the kinds of things that when you do what we do, eventually folks come along and they'll tell you stuff like this, and you just, like Greg's met some of these people in different contexts, and I'm sure Micah has too, and you just sort of shrug and say, well, okay, that's interesting, and it kind of makes me take this a little more seriously, or at least open my mind to the possibility that these things could happen. But there's no question that people in the government in the United States, and probably other countries too, the Soviet Union ran similar programs, and probably Russia still does, we're looking into this. And it wasn't because it was just pie in the sky stuff. It was because, as Greg said, they were getting at least some results that they found, actionable and useful.
I want to actually touch on just one thing, coming back to your discussion of what Holly experienced. You say that you always summon the demons, and she pulls out the name Lucy, and the first thing I thought was, Lucifer, hellfire and brimstone's going to get you. It was Lucifer. Can't believe you didn't pick up on that. Yeah, exactly. So maybe Holly summons the demons, actually. Got to think next level thinking, right? That's what remote viewing's all about. You follow me? But just kidding, by the way. I just did that. Ladies, bam, right there, just like that. Mic drop, yeah. But, also, though, to chime in on something else that you were discussing right there with regard to the likelihood that Russia probably still would use something like this. Again, I think that, and actually also coming back to another analogy about the defense spending that goes on behind the scenes that's off record or black budget. This, in regard to UFO research, is a subject that comes up a lot, as our colleague Ryan Sprague back there also knows. And this is a reality of the way that that government works. A lot of it has to do with need to know. And, a quick note about popular skepticism. I consider myself very much a skeptic. I do. I am a skeptic to my core. I have a disdain for the way that the modern skeptical mind operates. I consider both of these gentlemen skeptics, too. I don't know if you guys... He may call himself a Pyrrhonist, Greg.
It's an agnostic.
Militant agnostic. Yeah, skepticism is a good thing, but the problem is, I think, that when you kind of have an agenda behind your skepticism in the sense that skepticism is a predisposition, or it is an ideology through which you filter everything. I mean, it actually, in effect, should be that, but it shouldn't be accompanied by a bias in the sense that, I've made up my mind already, now let's disprove what I already know doesn't exist. You have to be open-minded when you proceed skeptically. But with this modern skeptic attitude, there has kind of fomented among academic institutions, I think, this attitude that Well, if it seems like something that cannot be explained scientifically, people are going to get really upset if they find out tax dollars are being put behind something like that. But again, if there's a strategic capability, talking about the invisible individuals higher up who can't be named. There's a gentleman who's worked with the space program for a number of years and currently works, I probably shouldn't say exactly the program he works with, but I do know these things, and I've vetted this individual and read science papers that he's written. I can say at very least he works with the space program. Time and time again, he has said to me, he says, I have a high hope that we will learn new things about unexplained phenomena like UFOs by implementing things like remote viewing. And the first time he ever said that to me, I said, now how could you say something like that? I'm thinking, we need to apply science to these subjects. We need to look at this scientifically. And he says, yes, you're right, and we do, but he says, I haven't got much time for skeptics because when we're in government, being skeptical about whether we could get to the moon didn't get us there. You know, we have to be creative, we have to be innovative with our thinking, and there's a reason why government programs may exist that do involve esoteric ideas and far-out concepts, things that would be conceived of behind the scenes and kept quiet for purpose of not outraging a academic establishment that often would view these things as a utter waste of taxpayer dollars. So that's just a reality about this, I think, that has to be underlined. Now, really quickly about my own remote viewing experiment. My good friend Tiffany Mack and I decided that we wanted to try and do a somewhat controlled remote viewing experiment where we would each envision things and we would communicate to one another what we saw, and then we would write it down first, and one of us would project the image to the other somewhat. The other would try and envision what exactly is being perceived. In this instance, she first wrote down the object, and I was going to try and use that as my target. What is she thinking about? And I'm going to try and target something. I had no clues whatsoever about what this might be, and there were 3 images that came to mind. And you'll probably see some parallels in what I'm describing here to Greg's experience, in the sense that often when you try this for yourself, if you have even a modicum of success, it's going to have to do with something relatively mundane, like a Miss Piggy Pez dispenser. It's not going to really have to do with some groundbreaking information, which has been often, I've found, a criticism against alleged psychic phenomena. Well, if this is something so groundbreaking, why can't these people predict when a meteor impact is going to occur? Why do they predict, what color somebody's shoelaces are going to be on Monday morning when they show up at work? It's these mundane things. Well, that's something we can't explain, but you can't deny sometimes the consistency between people's ability to accurately report things. In my experience, I sat down and I tried consciously to just relax my mind and body and allow the first image or images that came to mind to just appear, and not without any kind of bias or anything like that toward this. I wanted to just try and allow this almost what would be the term, stream of consciousness, probably. So, right, yeah, and 3 images come from the information channel immediately. I have a gingerbread man with a broken leg, a house, and a fireplace. Those are the 3 things that come to mind: a house, a fireplace, and a gingerbread man with a broken leg. And so I said, okay, Tiffany, how did I do? And so we were connected on Skype, and she says, okay, you're not going to believe this. And she's got her paper, and she's written this down. She and her 2 daughters had built gingerbread houses the night before. Lily, her youngest daughters, had gotten broken, and they had put it up on the mantle above the fireplace. It was a gingerbread house on the mantle above the fireplace with a somewhat broken roof. And she said, that was pretty good. And so then just as the lightning round, she said, okay, I'll make a mean grilled cheese sandwich. Think, what kind of cheese do I use? And I said, Munster. And she says, absolutely. So I don't know, it was kind of that beginner's luck. After that, we didn't have quite as much luck with these experiments, but I did find that novel. And I've toured anyone here familiar, by the way, with the Ryan Research Center or the Ryan Center for Consciousness? It would have previously been known as the Ryan Institute for Consciousness Studies, and of course founded by J.B. Ryan, once associated with Duke University. But for those who don't know, this was a research division, I believe, at one time. It's now a private institute, but it was involved with Duke University in North Carolina, and they actually looked into the legitimate possibility that psychic phenomena can be studied scientifically in a laboratory. And they conducted experiments, and they had produced the famous Zinner cards, I believe, that have the little symbols, wavy lines. Anyone seen Ghostbusters? You guys have seen Ghostbusters. You'll remember the scene at the beginning where they hold up the cards with the little symbols on them. And so I've done a lot of experiments with those kind of things over the years, trying to, again, see if there is a repeatable way that this can be produced. And as far as repeatability, I got to say that if what they were saying to you, Greg, about 50%, 60, as much as 70% success rate, I mean, that's much greater than a statistic. Yes, that's far better than chance. That would be significant.
Yeah. Well, that's what they claimed. The detractors claimed it was less. So it's probably somewhere in between, but still way more than statistically possible or expected. As for the budget and the size, as far as I know, all they had was a building at Fort Meade with probably 10 people in it. I don't know how much of a budget that takes. There might have been more of a budget for it we don't know about. Also, there might have been other programs, almost certainly, that we don't know about using other aspects of it, and as Paul said, maybe still are, because it's useful. But as they told me, every one of the people I interviewed told me, it was the beliefs about it and the political climate of the time and who was in office and all that affected if their program could keep going. About a month or 2 months ago, I actually met one of the remote, he's still alive, so I guess I'm not going to say his name, and I'm sorry about that, but he told me a great story about the program and how it was, how it kept getting funding. I mean, they kept thinking they were like having a TV show canceled. They kept thinking, when the funding comes up again, are we going to get renewed? It's a big sigh from Paul. One of the actually, when they were driving, he said him and another guy in the program were driving to a meeting. One of the iterations of the program was called Center Lane. I think that was after Grill Flame. They were driving on the freeway in Washington, and there was a big backup in the traffic, and they saw a big sign on the freeway that said Center Lane closed. And they got very frightened that when they got to the meeting that they would lose their funding. He said however, when they got to the meeting, there were a bunch of generals there, a bunch of staffers, high-level people, and they were going through the budget. Are we going to keep this? Are we going to throw this away? Are we going to keep this? How about this one? And the people that were in charge of these programs would kind of argue their case. Say, do we need to keep this program or not? No matter what it might be. Are we going to keep using snipers in the Congo or something? Whatever, or this kind of technology. Are we going to keep doing this kind of research? So Center Lane came up, and everybody in the room voted no. So they were like, oh God, the sign was right, Center Lane is it. They said in the middle of the voting, a guy walked in. This sounds completely fake, but I trust the guy, and it's a great story. In the middle of the meeting, in this vote, a guy walked in a trench coat. I mean, this sounds so stupid. He walked in a dark trench coat, like maybe a Navy pea coat. He hung it up. He was smoking. Nobody else smokes in that room. He obviously was blowing smoke at people and being very alpha male about it. He listened. He said he listened to this, and they were saying, no, 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 we're not going to renew it. And he said after it was done, all the guy said was, Center Lane stays. And he got up and left, and they got funded again. One guy. I said, do you remember who that was? And he said, nope, I didn't know who he was. But obviously he was very important, outranked all these guys, because he says it stays, and he left. He didn't care about the rest of the agenda. So, that's just one story of what went on in that program and how it was, the politics behind it. And as I said, it was a lot of it was just people being averse to that kind of thing and saying, we're going to have to admit someday that we gave money to these psychics. So it lasted for, what was it? Probably late 70s to early 90s. Had a good run, and like Paul said, it probably still is going on in some form or another, because the information they got is useful and actionable in a lot of ways, combined with others. Like they will have spies somewhere, or human intelligence signals intelligence, humans in signals meaning from electronic means like internet, radio, whatever you want, and human meaning they get it from spies and people that are working for them and telling them what's going on. And this was just one other piece of information that they could use, not the only one. They didn't go do something based on what a psychic said. They did it when the psychic would confirm things for them. We know this and this and this and this. We know that, there's a site in Russia. They are building something. It's very big. The satellite tells us it's that, but there's a big building over it. In one example, somebody got an impression of this huge, huge submarine, the biggest submarine they'd ever seen. And months later, this giant submarine comes sliding out of that big building. So they did actually get it right. And combined with everything else they did, they realized that they were building this huge submarine. Soviets like to build, I think they still do, like to have the biggest whatever it is. So they had this, the biggest submarine in the world at that time. So this is how it survived for quite a long time and may still. Paul, you drew a picture in there. I don't know why you drew the picture. Yeah, it reminded me, one more story. This has been going on probably since humans have been around. There's a book from 1930 called Mental Radio, written by Upton Sinclair, if you know who that is. He wrote The Jungle. He was basically, he actually ran for the socialist ticket in California in the 1930s because of his very deep social justice feelings. Farm workers, yeah. But he and his wife wrote this book called Mental Radio. And I think the second edition, actually Albert Einstein wrote the preface to it. You can find it. I think you can actually find it online. But he basically did remote viewing in the 1930s. He would sit in one room and he would think of something, and he would tell his wife, "What is it, dear?" And she would write down, and she would draw a picture, and they would see how well he did. And apparently he did well enough with his wife that they wrote a book and showed what they had done, how they had done it, and that it might be useful to people. So yeah, there's a history of this. It's not just, remote viewing wasn't called remote viewing. It's just remote viewing is a system for doing it, in a way for doing it in a systematic way that seems to work a little bit better.
Just three things. First of all, to put stuff into context. So Greg talks about a hit rate, if you will, of say 60 or 70%. Now everybody would, of course, like a hit rate. Wow, I can predict 100% of the time. Boom, you'd be rich. Here's the thing, you go to the Baseball Hall of Fame if you can hit a baseball 30% of the time. You bat 300 for 15 seasons in Major League Baseball, they put a plaque next to Ted Williams and Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and say, you're one of the all-time greats. And so, again, I'm a hopeful agnostic, I'm a skeptic, but when I hear what Greg calls fundamentalist skeptics, or what I call true disbelievers, say, well, they only hit 60%, and that probably means it's only about 40 or 50, I go, you know what? 40 or 50 is pretty cool, especially if it's over 50. I'll take the 50-plus odds if I'm doing remote viewing on lottery tickets. I don't have this power, but I wish I did, because I could fund a lot of television programs. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that this is all relative. I was a smart student. I never averaged 100% on any course that I ever took. I thought 85 to 90 was pretty good, and you'd get an A. You got 95, you got an A+. But you still passed if you got like 55 or 60. And you still got your degree. And so that's actually a pretty good percentage. And while science, gravity works on sort of a 99.99999%, I'll put 0.0001% where maybe gravity doesn't work. But it's a law. It works every time. That's repeatable. But what happens with us human beings and our abilities isn't always repeatable. And musicians, Mike is a musician, I'm a musician, or I used to be, same thing. You can play the same song over and over and over again. I have. I didn't get the chords right every time. Sometimes my fingers I played this song 50 times, 100 times, recorded these songs. And sometimes when you're playing live, you just do a lousy job of it. Your fingers miss the keys on the frets. You screw up your guitar solo. Even Jimi Hendrix made mistakes. So when we're humans and engaging in human endeavor, we're familiar with the idea that you're not always perfect. So why do we expect these people who are remote viewers or claiming these abilities to be perfect? If they can reach a certain level that is, as Greg said, if it's 70%, you're double what the best baseball player in history had for his batting average. Well, that's pretty cool. You should be in the Hall of Fame of cool human behavior, and you should take that stuff seriously. Two other things. One real quick about the idea, Greg's talking about Project Stargate in these groups. And as he did it, I just kind of thought, Well, you know what? I've been at UFO conferences where I've actually been the guy saying, look, Project Blue Book, Project Blue Book, Project Blue Book, and you're probably all familiar with it, which was the official study conducted by the United States Air Force in the 1950s and 1960s into the UFO phenomenon. It's what is often called, with government programs of any sort, a storefront, where this is what we put out there, the relatively low-level functionaries in Blue Book's case, and this is the public consumption. Here you go, these guys are doing this. But meanwhile, there's no question, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there's no question the United States Navy had their own programs looking into it. There were higher-level U.S. Air Force programs, and that's not including what the other allied countries were doing and stuff. But Project Blue Book is what the public knew. There's a chance that Project Stargate and the folks that Greg's talked to and that we've been talking about were the storefront. And who knows, and we don't know, what existed behind the storefront. Even as a filmmaker, I know that Telefilm Canada has offices all across the country. The only one that really matters is the one in Toronto. They're the ones that fund film. Sure, Telefilm has an office out in Atlantic Canada, and they have a representative. I haven't talked to her in 15 years because I know there's no point. If I want the people that are really doing stuff, I'd have to go to Toronto and up the food chain. So what we sometimes see from the government isn't, even with these programs and the people that they bring forward, might be interesting people, but they might not actually be, they could be like a single-A baseball team. They might not be the major leagues, or maybe they are, but it's worth considering. One last thing, Greg's right. I did draw a little figure here. I don't know if you could see it, but we don't actually have anything up on the whatchamacallit back there, the screen, so I thought I'd do this. So this is Dylan Garland. That's an unhappy face. And so there's one other story that I remember, because sometimes, when Greg did the remote viewing, he's trying to do it, but he's not trying to do it in the sense that you're not, like, as he said, focusing every day. I actually believe that some of this, and that we haven't talked so much about the consciousness aspect or any, like, what's out there, but I've had runs of synchronicity, or what I call synchronicity, this idea that we're tapping into something out there and we're pulling at least bits of it in, sometimes consciously and sometimes subconsciously. So in Dylan's case, Dylan comes to me when we're at the Astor Theater. He says, Paul, I want to talk to you. I had this was early on in our shoot. He said, I had a dream last night. Dreams. So he says, well, okay, here's what I dreamed about. And basically he said, I'm in a room and I'm filming you guys and in this house, and you're over there, and then I'm over there, right? I think that's right. Looking back at me filming you guys, and then that me, and we had a joke on the crew that I would pay $5,000 to any crew member who levitated on camera. It's no good to me if it's not on camera. And I haven't had to pay that yet. And then Dylan said, me with the camera started levitating in his dream. So I can't, he hasn't gotten his $5,000. Right, or lifting me, but he was moving off the ground. So, okay, cool. Dylan had a weird dream. Maybe that makes it in that episode. Maybe it doesn't. And it turns out it doesn't, because lots of other stuff happened. So that was low on the thing. We get to a subsequent location, Cooper's Inn in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, where Dylan's mother used to live, and when she was young. But Dylan, had you ever been there? He had never been there, that's right. And his grandmother showed up too and walked him through it and said, oh, this is where we used to do this, is where we used to do this. So Dylan's never been there. Walks up to the top floor. There's 3 floors. Kind of, it's their suite. They've turned it into an inn, and up on the top floor is this, what used to be the attic. It's this lovely suite now. And I get a call from Dylan, Paul, you've got to come up here. And so I come up, and he said, this is the room. And I went, what room? The room in my dream that I told you about in the Astor Theater. I was standing right there. You guys were standing right here. And I went, oh, well, that's cool. I don't know what to do with that. But he didn't levitate. But we started filming, and my brother put the camera on his shoulder, and Dylan and I started, do a segment. Cool, tell me about your dream and point out you were here in your dream, we were over here, this kind of stuff. And he said, this is kind of what my dream looked like, because he handed the camera off, and he was both sort of on camera and filming it in different places. We finished that off. It was about 6 minutes long. I sat down, and I said, I want to review that to make sure we get it right, because we're kind of recreating something. So if we didn't do it right, we can do it again. We hit play. Our sound person, no problem. Actually, this clip is on the internet. You can, maybe I'll send a link to the East Coast Paraconference page. You can see our reaction. So the camera mic, though, which is the mic that Dylan had attached to the camera, Greg's, I think, seen this. We start talking, you see us talking. Okay, and then we get into it, and I was here, and suddenly, now, you can still hear us talking. So it's not like the thing flipped out or wasn't working, but suddenly the static, and then the static, as it goes on, we continue talking. We don't know this is happening because Chelsea has separate audio from the camera, and she, no problem, heard us fine. And it starts changing pitch and modulating speeds and everything. And as Dylan said, we've heard a lot of stuff in our careers. I used to be an audio guy, ran a recording studio. We've never heard anything like this. As Dylan put it, we've never heard anything like that seems to have character. And that even as he was talking about the dream and describing certain things, that's when it would change its pitch. So that's just a weird room. But all of that stems back to a dream that Dylan woke up and said, I picked this out of the ether. I dreamed this scene. And then what he dreamed was the place that he had a personal tie to without knowing it. He'd never been there. And also then weirdness happened once we got there. Now that, I'm not sure I'd call that remote viewing, but I think remote viewing, if it exists, is interrelated to all of these other things. That it's precognition, sure, it's like Minority Report, the Steven Spielberg film. You can see things that are going to happen in the future. And sometimes it comes in, look, Paul McCartney famously said he wrote Yesterday, his most popular song, because it came to him in a dream. Got up, scribbled it down, called it Scrambled Eggs. That was the original title for Yesterday. Decided that was a bad title, but kept the rest of it. I mean, like sometimes stuff just seems to come to you and then it has a meaning. In Dylan's case, I think that happened. And I think it's the same kind of action in a slightly different way as remote viewing as a lot of this other stuff that's going on. And I think the important thing is, as Greg noted, if you try and do it, like try too hard, it doesn't necessarily work. Yeah, your brain will explode. But good, I've talked to a lot of good athletes, and they'll tell you, they'll use the phrase, we got in a zone, we were feeling it. And they're not trying to, baseball players will tell you, especially pitchers, I used to be a pitcher, if you try and force your location, if you're pinpointing, I got to put the ball right there, it winds up over there or on the ground. But if you just cool, and you know you're going to throw the curveball, and it, yeah, and you get out of your way of your body, your preconceived notions, whatever holds us back. And I think a lot of that has to do with all of these things, including remote viewing.
When Paul's talking about this, I'm also reminded, and Micah can have the mic next, that, and I did mention this before, if there's an emotional component like there was with Dylan, something that is personally connected to you seems to work much better. This is why they took people to the location afterwards when they first started doing remote viewing, because they got the feedback and the excitement if they got it right, and the emotion associated with that, and also the emotion of, it's like, oh, I'm outside in a park and it's very pretty and the sun's out. That's an emotional feeling. That was part of the signal that they needed, the carrier, was this emotional component. I was also reminded when Micah was talking about the Zener cards with the wavy lines, and they found out, and I think Michael will agree with me, that after a while, if somebody was doing guessing experiments, they would trail off. If they were good at it, they would still trail off. It's because they got bored. They have no connection to the stupid cards, but or flipping coins or whatever it is. So as psychic research developed, people realized if there's something that's personally important, like people always get precognitions about relatives and things like that because you're very closely and personally connected to these people. And so that opens up it becomes that dimension of it, that component of it opens up the signal or the line of the signal to you. And in 80s and 90s, I went and interviewed Dean Radin, who some of you might have heard of. He's head of the Institute of Noetic Sciences now. At the time, he was at the University of Las Vegas, where I met him in Vegas, and we discussed some of this over 5 hours. I did a 5-hour interview with this guy who's so smart it scares me. I've interviewed him twice, once on my show and once at this restaurant in Vegas. And he's one of those people that I love to talk to because I'm running at 100 miles an hour mentally trying to keep up with him. And he's slowing himself down just a little bit just so I can keep up. And I know he's doing this because I listened to the interview later on the tape I made, 5-hour interview. The reason it was 5 hours is because he was trying to explain to me these concepts about time being an illusion and how we look at reality. And I would say, oh, so what you're saying is this. And he'd say, sort of, and he would keep explaining something to me till I got it. He took the time with me to do this in his busy schedule, being who he is. But one of the things he's developed, I think, along with the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research people who were active in Princeton in the 80s and 90s, I believe, was they started, in fact, I took a picture of them next to one of these devices. It was a random number generator, which basically does, it gives you zeros or ones. They're virtual coin flips, thousands and thousands of times a second. And instead of trying to guess what a coin flip is, they changed it to, let's see if we can influence it, mind over matter. But it was just electronic, so it was very ephemeral. It's just a random circuit going 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1 thousands times a second. And then it records what those zeros and ones are and how many there were of them, and over hundreds and hundreds of trials where people just sat there and said, okay, it's going to be more zeros than ones, it goes into a statistically significant percentage. Like, there's a 0.01% chance that it's going to have this many zeros over this amount of time. And as they gather that information, they find out over thousands of trials and hundreds of people doing it that it becomes way over significant, way over what chance would be. So that's one aspect of psychic research that really interested me. And they've done other things too. Maybe Mike, I can describe some of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, questions too.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll kind of make this kind of tied up briefly here, but with regard to the random number generators and coin flips, interesting thing, really what I'd highly recommend as it relates to if you really want to try and look at psychic research critically. A lot of these little experiments look rather trivial. Flip a coin, okay, heads or tails. Flip a coin, okay, heads or tails. Flip a coin, okay, heads or tails. Flip a coin, and so on ad infinitum. But that repetition, is data. And if you're going to do science, you got to gather this data. Now, a mathematician would also say that, the curve, whether statistically likely or unlikely, is governed by mathematical facets. I'll tell you one thing that fascinates me about math is that if you really look at mathematics, and there's a great book by Professor Jordan Ellenberg called How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking. If you didn't think math was interesting, read that book. It'll change the way you look at the universe. I'm serious. But the thing about it is that mathematics and those numbers that we use in our data sets are not a direct corollary for reality. They simply are not. They're very close, and many would say that, well, there's an equation that explains everything. We come close, but usually we have to have a model for this, a model for that. We don't have a grand unified theory of everything in physics. And with regard to mathematics, that language we use, it doesn't always directly correlate with concepts and realities. So we should say that. Coming back to the mystical, I do want to, again, try to emphasize that everything that we've talked about during this panel with relation to the process of remote viewing, which we might define kind of roughly as a systematized method of utilizing an apparent extrasensory perception with a target to glean information over a distance. I'm just throwing that out there. Hopefully that works. But the idea would be, though, that this is built onto a pre-existing idea about similar experiences and abilities possessed by the human mind. Somebody's getting into a fight out there, guys. Excuse me. But they're really having some fun out there. Wow! The idea is that, again, if this is something that is innate to the human experience, it should be studied and learned about. And Lawrence LeShan, who wrote the book, literally, How to Meditate. It's a wonderful book about meditation. Almost. In that book, there's a very brief point, and although he actually wrote a follow-up book that was all about government programs and extrasensory perception, the book How to Meditate, he actually specifically, thank you, by the way, he specifically says when paranormal phenomena or extrasensory phenomena occurs, you do enough meditation, you learn to quiet your mind enough, this kind of phenomena will happen. You will experience it eventually. And Lawrence LeSean's advice was, when that happens, when you have your first ESP moment, ignore it. Forget about it, because that is not what meditation was designed to do. And I actually differ with him on that point in the sense that, well, in the Western world, we're addicted to our jobs and the speed of life. And really, I think that meditation in the West has become this thing where we learn to detach. And while that's useful, I don't know that truly in, for instance, the East and in the ancient times, it was necessarily exclusively just quiet your mind, shut up, and learn to tune out for a little while. I think that maybe yogis, shaman, practitioners of the mystical arts, they indeed did recognize these extrasensory experiences. Rather than being something extraordinary like we see today, they probably saw that as something that was unique, but nonetheless also unique to the human experience. They were important experiences and something that we should learn more about because they are a part of... Yeah, exactly. Of course they thought it was normal. It was something that was part of being human. So if remote viewing is anything that is an extension of those things, this is something that, yeah, like you said, Greg, and like Paul touched on, it's something we should all be able to do hypothetically, and it requires a couple of things, an open mind, and I think, yes, a system so that we can understand exactly what mechanisms allow for it. So why don't we get to some questions now, guys, if we have a few. I'll let you hold this.
Any questions? Experiences, skepticism, believerism, whatever. Like I said, I'm militantly agnostic, meaning I try not to say, this must be it. I like to basically keep my mind, open to the point where I don't make a decision about something, because then I think that the information will stop coming in and I will close myself off to something useful that either confirms or disconfirms my feeling at the time. And everything I have, except for moral things, don't hurt people, don't kill people, basically 10 commandments, I guess. But moral questions, no. But just about everything else, I'm pretty much open, and and I'll take things on a case-by-case basis, and I'm open to having my opinion change, which has happened many times. So, everything I'm saying up here was a result of basically doing this over a long time, talking to a lot of people, experiencing it for myself, and keeping an open mind. And almost, at this point, I think you have to keep almost a non-emotional, Zen-like mind about a lot of these things. Because if you let yourself get emotional about it, like I say, it's funny, it shuts off a channel. It shuts off your information channel. So, I'm still learning about this kind of stuff, and it still excites me, and I still like to hear about it. I mean, last night we were on that ghost hunt. I saw things there I'd never seen before. That doesn't mean I jump up and down and say that ghosts are everywhere and, oh my God, and it's like, I'm pretty sure there are things called ghosts. I'm almost certain of that because I believe people that have seen it. But when something happens to me like that, I get a little bit of a confirmation, and I think, oh, well then, I think there really is something to this. That I don't know what the model is. I don't know what's causing it, but it's something that's out of the ordinary, and I'm going to listen to people that are doing this because I think that there may be something there. Before it happened to me, I still listened to them. But now that it has happened to me a little bit, and some very strange things happen there, which I really try to think, oh, there's nothing to this, but I can't just sit there and throw it away and say, well, that wasn't very important. Some of it was quite important, at least to me, because it had a personal component. So I think that's basically my attitude, and it's one I try to get. It works for me. I don't know if it works for you, but it's a nice thing to carry with you all the time. Very open-minded, but also on the lookout for whatever. Sloppy thinking. I'm not completely. I'm not innocent of sloppy thinking, and I like it when people should point out that I have it, as long as they do it nicely. Well, I haven't heard. Paul or Micah may be different, but I haven't heard anything presently. Obviously, it was done in the past. I think if something's useful, officially or unofficially, people are going to use it. The military mindset, I was never in the military, and I'm not going to say that I know how it operates or how people operate in the military, but I've talked to a lot of people that were in it, and they said everything is very regimented. Of course, it has to be, because that's what a fighting unit does. But there are things like Joe McMoneagle told me, for instance, unofficially, he was in Vietnam. He said he would be sitting in a lawn chair, at wherever the base they were out, somewhere where they would occasionally get attacked. If people saw him get up from his lawn chair and walk into the building, they'd all do the same thing, because they started to realize that he knew something was coming. And he might not even notice it. He'd just feel like, oh, maybe I should go in the building. Then, 10 minutes later, rockets start hitting them. So I think if something works unofficially, yeah, I think they will use it. They may not acknowledge it. Officially, I'm not sure. Possibly. At this point, things that happen in this world, we find out about 5, 10, often 15, 20 years later, especially if it's useful at the time. Because if it's useful at the time, of course they don't want anybody to know about it. And they watch very closely people who are interested in it to see how much they know. But yeah, unofficially, probably. Makes sense.
Carl Flock, the guy I was talking about, once told me, here's what the American government has, and he said most governments are like this. So here's what we publicly acknowledge, our weapons systems, our practices. And by the way, when you hear people say we can't tell you about this because of sources and methods, usually what the intel agencies will tell you when they don't want to reveal certain information, sometimes that's true, and who knows what those sources and methods that they're using are. It could be, I'm going to go off the ledge here, it could be one of our sources and methods is remote viewing. We're using remote viewing. We can't tell you how we found out where Osama bin Laden was, because we don't want to admit that we use this stuff because it's a useful tool. I am not saying that they found Osama bin Laden through remote viewing, but who knows? But if, as Greg said, if it was a useful program, if they were receiving intelligence from it in the past at whatever level, two things I'm reasonably sure of. They would continue using it. The military and the intelligence agencies don't stop using things that are working. They continue using things that aren't working too. They definitely keep the things that are. And the other thing is we wouldn't hear about it if it was working. And so as Carl said to me, here's what you know about. This is what they'll admit or what they've seen and they can't deny. And that stuff is anywhere between 5, as Greg said, to 20 years behind what they really have. And in some cases, a lot of that explains UFO sightings. Not all of it, but a lot of it. You're seeing things that the military knows it has, but the general public does not. And eventually it'll come out, 20, 30. The atomic bomb, for instance. Nobody knew that they were working on an atomic bomb until they had atomic bombs exploding. And, whoa, what was that? That's the whole point. You don't tell folks. And if something like this, as an intelligence gathering thing, say you had a spy in the middle of North Korea right now, you wouldn't go, unless you're Trump, you wouldn't go tweet out, we got a spy in North Korea. His name is Bill. What? What happened to Bill? Nothing good. I mean, you keep that stuff secret. So I would suspect that if there was an efficacy to the remote viewing programs, that it went deeply underground, it still exists, they're still using it. And if there wasn't, then it doesn't exist anymore. But the takeaway is there's no way for us to know.
One thing people bring up to me, say, well, secrets can't be kept. Well, how do you know? Well, we found out about the atomic bomb. We found out about remote viewing. We found out about, yeah. That is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. What do you mean they can't keep secrets? That means the stuff that we don't know about is, if they can keep secrets, that means we haven't heard about the stuff that the secrets they can keep. And people can keep secrets. I'll give you another great story about keeping secrets. About 10 years ago, I was having Thanksgiving dinner with my father and mother and sister and wife, and I was talking to my dad about what he used to do. He developed rocket fuels in the 1950s and 60s for the space program. He has patents on rocket fuels. I said, what's the weirdest thing that ever happened? He worked for Aerojet, actually, very early defense contractor, one of the first aerospace companies. I said, so what's the weirdest thing that ever happened? That's a great question. If you have, I mean, I've been doing a radio show for years. If you're stuck for a question when you're trying to ask somebody about whatever they do, just ask them what the weirdest, strangest, most memorable thing that ever happened. That's like 15, 20 minutes of conversation, depending on what it is. So I asked him that. What's the weirdest thing that ever happened? He said, well, one time we were sitting there and, or I was doing some experiments with some substance that we're going to put in rocket fuel. And you know where you have those things called a pipette, where you stick it in the thing, you put your finger on the end, it has a little graduated thing in it, so you can see how much you're measuring. He had a face mask on and a lab coat and all that. He said, and it was very unstable substance. I put it in wherever I was putting it in, and I was bringing it back over to put the thing down, and there was a drop that I didn't see that was still left on the end of it. The drop came down and hit the table, and he said the explosion from that drop hitting the table was so loud he lost his hearing for 3 days. And I said, Dad, what was that stuff? And he said, I can't tell you. I was like, that was what, 40, 50 years ago? You can't tell me? I said, I could look it up on the internet. And he said, you probably could, but I can't tell you. Why not? I signed something I can't tell you, ever. And that really floored me. I mean, right in my own family, my dad he was still keeping a secret like that. And it was something, like I said, I could probably look up, and he knew it. But his sense of moral, his morals and his, even patriotism and all that was such that he would not tell me that. So when people say that the secrets can't be kept, I don't believe that at all.
In that very line of thought, again, you add 20 years in prison and heavy fines or more, depending on the offense, in addition to often a strong sense of ingrained, socially enforced patriotism. Yeah, people can keep secrets. I know a lot of people who keep secrets. I've got a lot of questions that people won't answer for me because people are much better at keeping secrets. And, again, just to pick on the hard-lined denialist skeptic attitude really quickly in relation to that. I've spoken with a lot of skeptical thinkers who think that, well, first of all, people can't keep secrets, and this would have been public knowledge by now, and if there hadn't been a whistleblower or a leak or somebody on a deathbed confession that just spilled the beans entirely, this would have been public knowledge, and therefore UFOs can't exist, and this remote viewing, there's nothing to it, because all of that would be public knowledge right now. Think again. That's extremely naive thinking. People can absolutely keep secrets, and they don't want to go to jail.
Just ask yourself, would any of you want to be Edward Snowden? I mean, Edward Snowden released some secrets. Chelsea Manning released some secrets, and not, just, again, the tip of the iceberg. And look at what happened. Chelsea Manning went to jail, and Edward Snowden is probably never going to come back to the United States home unless he comes back in handcuffs. And when he comes back, Edward Snowden might disappear. Although he's such a public figure now, they'll probably put him on. And frankly, I think they should. I think he broke the law, so there's a consequence to that. And then maybe at a sentencing phase, they can mitigate his sentence because it was a moral thing for him to do, to release this information. Who knows? But the takeaway, though, is he broke his security oath. Edward, there are consequences to that. And there can be very serious consequences to that. And so that's at a super high level. I mean, I used to work for the government film agency. I had access to files about people's, finances and stuff. I didn't go around telling people. A, it could get me fired, and B, 15, 20 years later, I still won't talk about it. And that's not classified stuff. That's just ingrained in your job. You're doing a job, and you keep that information confidential. Imagine if you're not at confidential level, you're at ultra, super duper, whatever it is, top secret level, and you face the kind of consequences that Micah was talking about. And sometimes those consequences can extend to your family and to your friends. And people talk about, they threaten my family and friends. And a lot of people say that, and a lot of those people aren't telling the truth. But there are enough of those people who are telling the truth that they really sometimes do threaten your family and your friends. The consequences can extend outwards. especially if you're involved in really, really deep intelligence stuff. And by the way, they tend to have a pretty good vetting process. Every now and then you get a Snowden, but generally speaking, they take you through a process. And when you are finally let into the secrets and stuff, they have a pretty good idea of who you are. And 999 times out of 100, they're absolutely right. You're the kind of person that will keep those secrets. And the one time that they're wrong, well, it's Snowden. Or we never hear about it because the guy doesn't make it out of the building. That's my pitch for my next film.
Are there any other questions? We've got, I think we're at the end of the time, aren't we? Okay, are there any other questions? Hi. I can't remember if he said what his perspective on it was, except what I said before, that if something is emotionally connected to the person doing the viewing, or whatever the psychic functioning is, it seems to work a lot better. Something that has either emotional or some sort of personal content for that person. That seems to be open the channel a little bit better. As far as I remember, that's what, because I think Raiden is more involved with remote influencing. That's his expertise. Although he probably knows far more about remote viewing than I ever would. And he knows a lot of people that are subject to keeping secrets and all that, so there are certain things he couldn't tell me. I'll tell you something about people that keep secrets and talking to them. If they want to tell you something, they will do it in an oblique way, and sometimes it takes a long time, and sometimes you have to ask the right questions. The thing they like the most is if you come to them with information that they did not know before, because that's like handing them a wad of cash. Information for intelligence people is their currency, and I found that out while working on Project Beta. If I would actually pass messages back and forth to these different people that I talked to, because they would say, "Why don't you ask so-and-so about this?" And I had no idea what they were talking about. Why don't you ask so-and-so about, Egypt and a certain place in 1978, okay? And I'd go and ask the person, they'd say, "That's what that was." Okay, anyway, and then they'd go on with me. Because it didn't make any difference to them anymore. That program was over and the person that told me knew that. But it was something they might want to know. And I told them that, and these people were being nice to me. They were basically handing me money to hand to the next person. And if they wanted to get some information out, they would do it, but almost never directly. It's kind of like, if you guess, I'll tell you, because then the onus is off of them of admitting something. If you guessed it, they didn't tell you, so they don't have to get in trouble for it. But that's a fascinating part of it, and a lot of them are very unemotional, like to the point of frighteningly unemotional. You ask them the wrong question and they change the subject almost like a magician, just like, weren't we just talking about that other thing? Oh, I guess we're not talking about that anymore. They're good at that kind of stuff. That's their job.
Just real quick, if you ever make a film and you want to use pictures of former CIA directors in your film, you don't have to, but if you're an honest person like me, you call the CIA and you won't say, "Can I speak to your public affairs person responsible for film liaising?" If you watch movies, you'll often see with the cooperation of the U.S. Defense Department or the CIA or whatever. So I call him up and I talk to this guy. This should have been a 1-minute conversation. Can I use a picture of Rear Admiral Hillenkotter? Can I use a picture of this guy? Sure, why not? I had an 1.5-hour long conversation with the guy. Texas accent, lovely fellow. How y'all doing up there, kind of thing. Hey, Paul Kimball, where are you from? Nova Scotia. And just great. Got off the phone. I thought, this is CIA. These guys are awesome. Like I'm sure they kill people, but this guy, super friendly. Seems like a good guy. It's probably like a handshake. Seems like a good film producer. I call Carl Flock, my CIA friend, former CIA friend, up a couple of weeks later. I tell him about this. And again, it's like me with the iceberg comment. I think, look at me, super, I got along, and everything like that. Had a great chat. And Carl, there was silence on the other end of the phone. He said, "You're an idiot." And I went, "What?" He said, "He's not being friendly. He's mining you for data." And I went, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, it's not because you know the secrets of the UFO. It's just like that's what they do. Their job when somebody calls them up to ask for anything in public affairs is to talk to you as long as you can, because in an 1.5 hours you might have said something stupid. You just never know. Did you tell him you smoked marijuana?" Which I have not. Stuff like that. And I said, "No." He said, really? And he said, yeah, there's no detail too small for them. There's a file on you sitting at the CIA now. Cool, great. So that's what they do. They mine you for data, and as Greg, that's a minute way, but often in meta ways, they will contact you and say, we have stuff for you, but what they really want is stuff from you. And you don't know why, but that's what they do. That's what they're paid. There's an exchange, and it's you're on the wrong end almost always. And if you think you're on the right end, you're just not. You're not playing the right game.
So, any more questions? I think we went way beyond the scope of actual remote viewing, but it encompasses so many things that we kind of had to. And we all hope you enjoyed it, and thanks so much.